Let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker this morning. So let me excuse me for a minute there while the slides comes up. Okay, so the first speaker we have this morning is Eddie Reeves, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and just kind of show you the highlights of each speaker's credentials, so that you can kind of see it yourself there, and then as a means to help you visualize what each speaker brings to the table. Eddie Reeves heads Reeves Securities Group, a strategic communication consultancy that helps corporations, nonprofits, and trade associations develop and execute sophisticated public relations, marketing, public affairs, issues management campaigns. Eddie writes and speaks nationally on effective communications, campaign strategies, social media, employee engagements, leadership development, and public policy. And Eddie has been spotlighted nationally for his expertise in crisis communications. And by the way, this is just a very succinct and summarized version of Eddie's bio. He brings a lot to the table as far as his experience in this area. So we're looking forward to having Eddie come up and share with us this topic, a key topic on communication, especially in light of data breaches that may occur. So I want to go ahead and have you lead you in welcoming our first speaker at the symposium this morning, Mr. Eddie Reeves.
Thank you. Bo, thank you. Thank you so much. Hey, folks. Okay, so first point. I am from Texas, and I am from East Texas, which is kind of part of the Deep South, if you don't know much about the 5 different regions of Texas. And I grew up in the Missionary Baptist Church. The African-American Missionary Baptist Church tradition is a tradition of call and response. In that tradition, I call and you. And in our church, if you don't respond, we just take up another offering. So let me try that again. Hi, folks. Oh, much better. Much better. Yeah, if we can get my presentation pulled up. So let me just, a couple of disclaimers right from the top. I'm not a technologist. I say that proudly. I barely know how to turn on a computer sometimes. So what's a non-technology guy doing talking to a group of this like awesome technologists? Let me tell you just a little bit more about my background so that you know it. I hopefully won't waste your time here. I am not a technologist, but I have played one on TV a little bit. I spent 5 years as the chief marketing officer of an IT services company in Plano, Texas. Some of you may have heard of by the name of Perot Systems. Now it's Dell Services. It's the services arm of Dell. At that time, Perot Systems was the largest provider of IT in hospitals in the country. Spent 5 years doing that. Prior to that, I spent a couple of years on the Hill as press secretary to a senior member of Congress back during the Clinton healthcare wars in the early 1990s. A senior member of Ways and Means by the name of Jake Pickle. Jake Pickle not only chaired the Health Subcommittee for a while, but he went on to chair the Ways and Means Oversight Subcommittee. And in that capacity, we spent an awful lot of time working with and overseeing the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and what they were doing in the area. If you need it, guys, I have it on thumb drive. Overseeing what they were doing in this area as well. But probably the most recent experience is I just came off a 3-year stint on the board of the Parkland Health and Hospital Systems in Dallas, Texas, which is our county safety net health system. It is our safety net hospital, and our public health clinics for all of not just Dallas County, but really all of North Texas to a great extent. In that capacity, I not only chaired the IT committee of the board, the Information Technology Committee of the board, but also chaired the Audit and Compliance Committee of the board. I was part of a reform board that was appointed to turn the system around because, as some of you who may know the world of urban public health know, Parkland just went through a near-death experience over the last 3 years where CMS and the state of Texas came in and found some major flaws in the way the system was operating. And quite frankly, the system came perilously close to losing its Medicare and Medicaid funding, which is about 70% of the funding of the system. And the fix to all of that. Now, guys, somebody's going to have, Bo, you guys are going to have to tell me how to go forward on this. Somebody's going to tell, yeah, a clicker would be great. So that's my background. Now, let me ask you, how many of you here work directly for a public entity, public sector entity? Raise them high. A few of you. Okay, how many of you here work for vendors or contractor organizations that either have or may have contracts with public sector entities? Raise them high. So altogether about half the room. And then how many of you work for private sector entities that those entities may work with public sector entities? Raise them high. So if you add all those hands up, that's about 80% of the room. So guess what, folks? Welcome to politics. You're all in politics. You didn't know that, did you? You will. You will very, very soon. It's not just Snowden. It's not just Target. It's not just WellPoint. For better or for worse, you are in one of the hottest areas of public discourse in the country right now. And if you have not experienced a crisis, and God forbid you ever do, at least a third of you in this room will within the next 24 months. Certainly the next 36 months. And so it's my argument that all of you need to be prepared. Oh, I don't know where he went. That all of you need to be prepared to deal with that. Let's see if we can get it this way. It works. So, the other thing I do now, for the last 6.5 years, I hung out a shingle 6.5 years ago, and I'm a public affairs and public relations and marketing consultant, but a big part of my practice is in crisis communications work. In an earlier life, I've done a bunch of different things. I was a newspaper reporter and columnist. I was press secretary to the mayor of Houston. I was press secretary to a member of Congress, as I said. And then I was in the private sector as part of a public affairs firm where we had a major crisis communications practice. And I won't go through the whole litany but a lot of the major crises you've heard of, Bridgestone, Firestone versus Ford, et cetera, we were involved in a lot of those things. So I know a little bit about that process. But the thing that's amazing about it to me is how many people are shocked when they're hit by it and totally unprepared when the crisis hits. And so what I want to spend just a few minutes of time with you today is running through some thoughts of how you can get more prepared for the crisis that does occur, how you can help your organization be more prepared, and then most importantly, how you could use this to put yourself in a much stronger position within your corporate organization. Corporate organization, whether that's public sector, private sector, or nonprofit sector. Because it is my argument from experience that one of the things, I can do it by manually here, but one of the things that was by experience is that one of the things that IT people never, ever, ever understand is how much potential power you have in an organization to move that organization forward. I can do it manually here. Yeah, to move that organization forward. And I think you guys sell yourselves way, way, way short on that. Now, part of the reason you do that is because, let's face it, when I went into Perot Systems, and I'm a walker, so I'm walking in. When I went into Perot Systems, I went in as the first chief marketing officer that organization ever had. That organization, the chairman emeritus of that firm is a guy named Ross Perot, little short, big-eared guy that ran for president. Some of you go, he thought a marketing guy was a guy with a hand in your pocket. My first meeting with him, he said to me, marketing? To me, that's just a guy with a hand in my pocket. How's that for your first meeting? Fortunately, the chairman and CEO of the firm was a guy named Ross Perot Jr., who hired me. So I got the opportunity to win him over. I'm very proud to say now that Perot Sr. and I have lunch once a month. We're very close. I want him over. It wasn't easy, but I want him over. But look, thank you. Thank you very much. See, I'm not a technology guy, so. Oh, the little arrow that goes forward. Wow, this technology stuff, man. But I'm very proud to say, that I took an organization from a standing start that had never had a marketing program in its history before. It was a Fortune 1000 company. When I joined, it was at about $2 billion in revenue. We took it over the next few years to about $3.5 billion in revenue. Had never had a marketing program because they didn't believe in it. And one of the reasons we were able to sell that, quite frankly, is because we had a couple of crises early on that let people know that crises do happen, and they're going to happen increasingly in this internet age. And it's like anything else. It's how you respond to it that has the huge impact on the brand of not just your organization, your company, or your public entity, or your nonprofit, the brand of your department and your personal brand as an information technology professional. So let's talk about, how do we deal with a crisis? How do we communicate our way through a crisis in these times of breach? First of all, the question you got to ask is, how do you define what a real crisis and crisis management is? And here's my definition. This is kind of like the truncated textbook definition. Crisis management is the systematic attempt to avoid organizational crisis, we'll come back to that, or to manage those crises, events that do occur. And crisis management communication is the strategic, that means non-reactionary use of communications in that process. That's what it is. So what does that mean? So the first question you got to ask when something arises is it a true crisis? Is it a true crisis? What's a crisis? It's a major unpredictable event that threatens or is perceived by key stakeholders to threaten, or is perceived by key stakeholders to threaten an organization or its staff, its clients, customers, patients, its reputation, and its legal or financial status. Now, why do I have this slide in here? Because a lot of things that people think are crises really aren't. If you've got a major hiccup or a bump in the road that you hit every now and then, pretty periodically, pretty regularly, that's really not a crisis. Now, you can turn it into a crisis if you don't respond to it right. But that's really not a crisis, because if it's something that's predictable, then you ought to have processes built in to deal with that. And if you don't, particularly from an IT perspective, that's your fault. It's not your CEO's fault. It's not your general counsel's fault. It's not the CFO's fault. I'm going to argue it's your fault. But I'm going to tell you how to fix that. All crises have 4 common elements. There's a threat, either real or perceived. And the perception of a threat, if that perception is deep enough, is the same as being real. Particularly today. It's got an element of surprise. One of the main things is there's a very truncated, a very short time frame to deal with it, much shorter now than ever before. That's one of the biggest defining issues of crisis management is people don't do well at the truncated time frame. Because our natural tendency as humans, our natural tendency when times get hard or complex is to freeze. The more complex, the more threatening the situation, the slower we want to move. Quite frankly, that is particularly true for technology and engineering types of minds, right? Because you want to sit down and analyze the problem. Let's do a root cause analysis here. Let's find out what the RCA says. You don't have time. Obviously, you got to do that before it's all over, but you don't have time at the beginning to do that. And crises have huge fallout, and this is growing every single day. Oh, by the way, one of the things I missed is that last bullet. That's what I'm most of the time on, and that is this, and this is the good news for you guys. The current state The current state of where we are in healthcare with breaches and other crises provides one of the biggest opportunities for you guys as information technology professionals that you've ever had in your professional career, if you approach it the right way. It's one of the biggest opportunities you will ever have in your professional career. And we'll talk about why that is. So, what's the fallout? Crises has this kind of fallout. This is why there's huge opportunity. It's going to disrupt the operations of your organization. It's going to have a financial impact. Obviously, it's going to have a huge legal impact. And that last one is the thing that people hugely underestimate the importance of, the value of, and the potential damage of, and that's the public reputation fallout from these crises. That last one is bigger than ever before. And why is that? Because everybody in the world who's walking around with a smartphone or a tablet is a journalist. There are 150 million journalists in America. And here's what people don't get, guys. The same people who are buying your product are the same people who are buying the stock in your company. They're the same people who are donating to the nonprofits you work for or influencing those who do. They're the same people who are voting for the politicians that regulate you. If you don't get anything else out of this presentation, I want to broaden your thinking about who the stakeholders really are, who the public really is. Because they ultimately have the biggest impact on your business. One of the things that's happened, particularly over the last 24 to 36 months, and I'm not sure you guys grasp the depth of this, but we're at an inflection point in the public consciousness now over data security. It's a time like never before, because the average American now, because of Snowden, because of Target, on and on and on and on, they don't get this stuff, they don't know any of the details of it, they don't want to know the details of it, but they know one thing: holy crap, my information is not secure. They're getting that now. The danger is in an environment where where that level of fear is growing and the level of knowledge is not growing with it, there's a tendency to overreact or react the wrong way on the part of policymakers or other people influenced by the public. There's a huge danger and tendency to do that. And that in and of itself will lead to more crises. But that's where the opportunity for you guys is. So, what is strategic crisis management? I do trainings on this for several different types of organizations and professional associations for their continuing education. And I'll truncate some of this, but basically, I argue there's four phases of crisis management. There's risk reduction, there's readiness, there's response, and there's recovery. All very, very important, but only one or two of those are the ones we usually focus on. So, what's risk reduction? It's where you actively work to reduce the risk of crises well before they happen. Here's the first area of huge opportunity for information security professionals. So, one of the things I thought was interesting when I listened to Ambassador Clark's presentation, one of the things he said is, get the CISO out from under the CIO, and there was a smattering of applause in there. Okay, I got some bad news for you guys. It ain't gonna happen no time soon. Because where are they gonna put you? General counsel don't want you if he's smart. CFO doesn't want you. Well, he actually does if he can cut your budget. Now, so I personally, I think, okay, that's fine for an academic discussion, but I try to live in the real world. And in the real world that I see, Here's the opportunity. Here's the challenge and the opportunity. You don't have a seat at the table. I'm in the C-suite right now. Because guess what? The CIO doesn't have a seat at the table. Why is that? Because from 1995 to 2000, every CEO in America loved going to the cocktail party and talked about all the money they were spending on this internet thing. And the CIO was the golden boy or golden girl. And then March of 2000 came around. Anybody remember March of 2000? And it became really, really difficult for the CIO to even get in the CEO's office. Matter of fact, and in a whole lot of Fortune 1000 companies, that's when the CIO, who had been taken out from under the CFO and was reporting direct to the CIO, got put back under the CFO or the head of shared services. What's my point on that? Guess what, folks? And I'm not a technologist, but I work with a lot of major corporations. I do a lot of consulting with boards and with CEOs and C-suite organizations. So I don't mean to offend anybody, but for the typical non-technologist in corporate America, IT's like air conditioning. Nobody thinks about it till it breaks. But once it breaks, they don't think about anything else. So guess what? There's your opportunity. Because you can say, hey guys, something may break here. And if it breaks, it's going to be bad. But what does that take on your part? First of all, it takes enough courage to start surfacing these issues, even when you know there are certain people in the organization who may not want them surfaced. Now, you got to be smart. I'm not saying commit professional suicide. But here's my argument on why that's crucially important, that you at least make the effort. Because in every single crisis, let me give you a perfect example. One of the things I've been involved in earlier in my career was a situation where a major educational institution, private educational institution of children, had a member of their staff sexually assault a child. And we went through that whole process, did what we needed to do. But the question that people had was, people get that there are loonies and scumbags out there. But here's the question people had for the institution. When did you find out you had that scumbag on staff? And what have you done to make sure those kind of scumbags don't touch any children again? Part of why we were able to get past that crisis so well, and it was just purely by the grace of God, it was pure luck, really, is that within a year before that, the head of HR in the organization had done some training, had done a training module that directly addressed it. And just being able to point to the fact that we were proactive before we even knew about it went a really, really long way to mitigating that crisis. This risk reduction, don't underestimate how it's so important. It's important because you want to mitigate the risk just from an operational standpoint. But from a public reputation standpoint, it becomes hugely important once a crisis does occur that you're able to go back and document all the things you did to try to address the risk before you even knew there was a crisis or was going to be a crisis. That's huge. Next, readiness. What kind of mechanisms are you putting in place to respond to crises? Do you have a crisis management plan? If your corporate organization does not have a crisis management plan, I'm talking about your entire organization, my argument is you're committing management malpractice. If your specific department doesn't have its own crisis management plan, that should be a component of the larger one, you are committing management malpractice. Will you follow the plan to the T every time? Of course not. And I think it was Dwight Eisenhower said, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. But guess what? Planning is essential. He also said nobody succeeds in battle without a plan. Why? Because what planning does is planning forces your organization, to pull back a little bit from the day-to-day and think strategically about how we're going to address something if it happens. One of the best things you can do as an information security professional, if your organization does not have a plan now, is to tomorrow or Monday go in, send a memo to somebody, and say we should have a discussion about creating a crisis management plan and how we get that done. It'll automatically put you in a different place in your organization. If you do have one, when's the last time somebody pulled it off the shelf and dusted it off and went over it and updated it? Write the memo on that. This is how you become not just a do-me-a person. You know what a do-me-a person is? Hey, do me a website. Hey, do me an email thing. Hey, do me a firewall. You don't want to be a do-me-a. You want to be a strategic asset to your organization. And these are the ways that help you get there. So you got to have a plan for how you're going to respond. And you got to practice it. It's not just having a plan. What's your process for walking people through that? One of the things I'm very, very proud to say that we were able to implement in a couple of different organizations that I've been involved in is at least 3 times a year, we would simulate a crisis and put our crisis management response team into effect just to see how they'd respond. And we learned something every time we did it. But here was the magic of it. After we did it a few times and got really, really good at it, the CEO decided, hey, this is something I want to go show to the board. So he actually brought in a couple of board members and let them watch us go through the crisis response program. Huge, huge. When's the last time any of you guys were in front of your board? And not in a bad way. Then response. That's when you obviously, this is the one everybody thinks about. This is how you actually react. How do you react in a way that mitigates the impact? Here are the important things. I'm running through this pretty quickly because I want to leave open time for dialogue. But in your reaction, here's what you got. Let me back up. Because this is a basic principle of effective communication, but particularly effective corporate. When I say corporate communication, that means communications in any large entity. One of the basic principles of effective corporate communications in a crisis is, remember this, folks. Everybody write this down. If this is the only thing you write down from this presentation, everybody write this down. People don't care what you know until they know that you care. Let me repeat that. People don't care what you know until they know that you care. And how do people judge whether you care? Are you addressing the stuff that I care about? Got a dirty little secret for you folks. Nobody cares about the stupid job you're doing every day. Nobody cares about my stupid job, my stupid product, my stupid service. We all listen to one radio station, WIIFM. What's in it for me? That's all we care about. That's all anybody cares about. What's my point on that? It's incumbent upon you to have and to maintain an understanding of what your organization really cares about. Not what's written on the mission statement, not what's written in the annual report, but what do the people who are in control of your organization really deeply care about? And frame your work and your communications about your work around those issues. That's how you get listened to. Quite frankly, Many people, and this has been a crisis in IT for 30 years. You guys talk too much about MIPS and BIPS and, I'm not a technologist, all that technology stuff. And it's important stuff, but you don't frame it in the context and in the language that the people at the top understand and care about. Why? So when you respond to a crisis, what ends up happening, the stuff you want to do is important stuff, but people don't get it because you haven't framed it in terms of what they respond to. One of the toughest parts of crisis management is there's always 80 different things you can and should do, but there's really only 3 or 4 that you really should do now. And there's always fights over that, and you're losing precious time and you're floundering. What'll help you decide without a question of what to focus on first is having that deep understanding of your organization. One of the things I have seen over and over and over in support organizations, whether it's IT, whether it's HR, whether it's facilities, whether, all of the staff functions in major organizations, I've seen it over and over and over. Very few of the management of those organizations really have a deep understanding of the business imperatives of the business. Do you really have a deep understanding of the imperatives of your organization? When I mean the imperatives, let me give you an example. There are certain organizations for whom the thing that the CEO goes to bed every night thinking about and gets up every morning thinking about is his merger and acquisition strategy. Because that's how he's going to build the business, or she's going to build the business. And that's what the board's holding that CEO accountable for ultimately. If that is the case, IT is huge, looms huge in that. And IT security looms huge in M&A work. But it's almost always an appendage, right, of the overall M&A plan. What if you knew that about your organization, what if every 3 or 4 months or twice a year, you sent a memo up through the whole chain of command of the management team analyzing, whatever big M&A deal that was in the Wall Street Journal 6 months ago or a year ago, and now they're a year down the road in the integration and they've run into all these snags and it's now been in the trade literature. What if you sent a 2-page memo or a 1-page memo up saying, hey, FYI, I want to give you this analysis, and these are the kind of things we need to be keeping in mind for the future and for our next merger or acquisition. You guys aren't doing that kind of stuff from a security perspective. But that's what's going to that's what's going to change the way you're viewed in the organization and make your crisis response a lot more effective. And then finally, recovery. That's how you assess and correct the damage and attempt to return the organization to its pre-crisis stage and beyond. And beyond. The smartest organizations I've ever seen who deal with crisis end up after the crisis well past where they were before the crisis. Anybody remember Tylenol? The Tylenol scare of 30 years ago? It's the single most effective painkiller marketing program that's ever happened. Because the way Tylenol responded to that crisis, they did something that was unprecedented. They took every pill off every shelf in every grocery store and every drugstore in the country. At the cost then of hundreds of millions of dollars. Today it would be billions and billions. But guess what? When they updated their packaging, updated their processes and all that kind of stuff, brought the product back out, their market share more than doubled. And over the next 10 years, their market share more than quadrupled. Why? because it's the way they responded to the crisis. That's the opportunity. So, like I said, you got to have a process. Let's talk real quickly about, I'll skip through some of this. So, and by the way, I think the association has these slides. I know they do because they have them, so you can get them from them. But here's the key, folks. Think ahead. You got to make the time. Yes, you're busy. Yes, you're understaffed. We're all busy. I get that. But you got to make the time. You got to find the time to think ahead about how information security, not just how you're going to do what you got to do over the next 3 to 6 months, but more strategically, how can we use information security strategically? I was talking to some folks outside. I mean, one of the things I continue to be amazed at, because this has been true for a few years now, but there's nobody out there building a whole marketing plan around their information security. And that could be huge. This is something people are really worried about. You can make information security a huge strategic market advantage. I don't care what you're selling. I mean, what you're about to see, and one of the things I do is there's a process called ascertainment where, and this happens all over the country, but where major media entities have these things called ascertainment sessions where they talk to a range of people, scientists and executives and PR guys like me, and they have these off-the-record sessions where we just talk about what's coming over the horizon. Because it's part, one of the real crises in journalism in America right now. I mean, 40% of journalists have lost their jobs in the last 36 months because of the internet. And it's mainly because of Craigslist. Why? Ooh, Craigslist. Here's why. Because 65% of the average daily newspaper's revenue came from classifieds. Craigslist killed classifieds. That's what happened in journalism. They talk about all this, stuff about the internet. It was Craigslist, folks. But they have these ascertainment sessions. And I've sat in on a couple of these, been invited to a couple of these. And one of the things that you're about to see a massive amount of coverage in the popular and the business press about is the Internet of Things. Now, this is probably something you guys have been reading about for a couple of years, right? It's only just now, it hasn't even hit the public consciousness yet, but it's about to, in a big way. But think about this. Somebody's going to come out with a product and sell it to say, hey, if you've got an elderly grandmother who's living alone by herself, you can remotely program her heat to come on when the temperature dips to a certain level. And the Internet of Things will allow you to do that. And that sounds really cool to people in the lay public. But guess what? Is there an information security risk there? Is there a HIPAA risk there? You bet your life there is. But if I'm the guy who tells the business, yeah, let's sell this, but while we're selling it, let's also talk about the fact that we've put in these protocols or these processes to make this information secure. Guess what? You just went from the left side of the ledger, cost, to the right side of the ledger, revenue. Because you're helping the sales guy now. And who's got the power in every private organization? Sales. That's the kind of thing. I mean, but you got to take the time to think through that stuff, right? You need to develop a policy that specifies the role of the various organizational segments in managing an incident. I mean, again, you can get these slides. Don't worry about trying to get all this down. Then you got to practice it. Once you're prepared, you got to practice it. You have to build the time and build the budget into your budget and into your time to practice this stuff. If you can't do it in your whole corporate organization, at least do it in your organization. Then you got to have a crisis management team. This is really important. The worst time to try to plan for responding to a crisis is once the crisis has occurred. You can't do it. Doesn't work. But if you have a team in place beforehand and you've prepared and practiced this stuff, it makes things so much easier. So what's a crisis management team? These are the folks that need to be on the crisis management team. You got to have a team lead. In a lot of companies, that team lead is the head of HR. In a lot of companies, some companies, the team lead is the COO. Some companies try to do it with the general counsel. That's a real problem in my view. We'll talk about that. And Cindy's heard me talk about that. But the one thing you got to have is that team lead has to have a direct link to the CEO. It's non-negotiable. You got to have whoever the person most responsible for environmental health and safety. You got to have your public relations person. If you don't have an in-house PR person, you got to have somebody. You got to have a consultant on speed dial. And let me talk about that for a minute. One of the big changes, huge changes in the business world now is this whole idea of the impact of public reputation and what I call public reputation risk. You know, it used to be if a CEO of a big corporation sat down to make a major life change, company changing decision, he usually had 4 seats around the table with him. He had his outside legal counsel, he had his investment banker, he had his auditing firm, and he had his management consultant. Guess what? In a post-Enron, post-Global Crossing, post-on and on world, post the financial collapse world, the smart CEO now has a 5th person around that table. And it's a guy like me who helps him manage his public relations risk or public reputation risk. Because it, quite frankly, has become, in some ways, the single most important risk, the single most damaging thing for long term to the organization. So you gotta have your HR people, of course. Legal absolutely has to have a seat at the table. Legal absolutely has got to be there. There may be some strategic situations where you want the general counsel as head, but the reason I say that you don't want the general counsel as head, because that may put your general counsel in an operational role that may limit some of your legal avenues later. And Cindy talked about a lot of that yesterday for those of you who were in her session. And I'll let her elaborate on that a little bit if she wants to when we get through. Obviously, your security people, you got to have a team coordinator. What is a team coordinator? That's kind of the project management person that's handling the traffic flow, that's keeping the documents, that's keeping the records, that's keeping everybody on task. And you need to have a designated crisis command center that everybody knows about beforehand. And it needs to be a facility that'll hold people, that has broadband secure, that has telephone lines, that you can stick a copier in, all kinds of considerations around that. And by the way, and every one of those, every member of that team needs to have a backup person. Let me run through. So here's what you got to ask. Number one, what happened? First question is what actually, not what I think happened, not what I heard happened, what actually happened. Second question is hugely important. Is anybody in danger right now? One of the places people get in huge trouble. How much time we got, Bo? Okay, 2 minutes. We'll go through this question. That's it. One of the places people get in huge trouble is they don't contain the crisis and they let these things continue to go on. Then you got to ask, do we know the cause, who's affected, and what's been our response so far? You run through these questions with the crisis management team, and that'll put you in the position to do better than you've ever done before. Let's take 1 minute or 2 minutes, since they stole 5 minutes when we started, for any Q&A. Anybody got? Yes, sir. Yeah, great question. Since we're in the healthcare track, was any of this particularly more important for healthcare? Yeah, the two things I think for healthcare that are really, really important is number one, I think that one of the things that happen, particularly with healthcare IT people, is you assume, even with both internally in your organization and externally, you assume people have a much, much better grasp of technology issues than they do. Even the people in your organization who you've briefed before, you think, well, I briefed them on this stuff. They don't get it. They figure you got it. So one of the things I think that's really, really important that IT people will be able to do, you have to be able to tell your story in stories. Don't talk in jargon. Give people a story that make either real or hypothetical, but that walks them through how the impact of what you do happens in the real world. Because in healthcare, that what happens is, that's what people do who are attacking you. That's what a trial lawyer is going to do. That's what a reporter is going to do. They're going to automatically talk about these things in a way. And it may not, I can't tell you how many IT people who said, that's just total BS. It doesn't even work that way. It doesn't matter. They told the story first. So that's what people believe. I'll just take one more question. Yes, sir. So Target's biggest single mistake, oh man, this is hugely important. I probably should have said this from the beginning. They didn't remember the basic, what I call the Watergate lesson. It ain't the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. Target didn't shoot straight from the beginning about how bad the problem was. Same thing happened to BP with the oil spill. We're sitting there watching this stuff gush out, and their initial response was, oh, we've got it contained, and it's not that bad. Are you kidding me? And so that's the big mistake that Target made. What a lot of this stuff comes down to, people will forgive an honest mistake. People will not forgive a dishonest cover-up. I'll tell you one more quick story and we'll be gone. So earlier in my career, I was involved with an organization that had a major breach. Real briefly, we acquired a small boutique company. That company did some healthcare-related financial services, revenue cycle work, collections work with hospitals. They were using a subcontractor without letting us know. That subcontractor downloaded several thousand patient records onto a disk, bought a new computer, new laptop, didn't like the laptop, took it back to the store, left the disk in the laptop. The store put the laptop back on the shelf. Somebody else bought it. They get home, turn the thing on, they got this disc. They took it back to the store. Who'd the store call? They called the hospital, the client. The way we got past that breach was one thing. We had just bought them a month before, and we were able to get the regulators and the press, because it hit the press. We had enough processes in place to say, part of why we bought this company is we saw the opportunity to improve it, to increase its value by improving this kind of stuff. And we had credibility on those issues because we had done all this other stuff I just told you about. And we had talked about it. We had made it part of our public marketing, our commitment to information security. It's the only reason we survived that. Guys, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you, Eddie, so much for your talk this morning, and we appreciate the insight. Eddie, come back up here if you would. I want to do just a small presentation to show our token appreciation. So on behalf of the Los Angeles ISSA chapter and the Southern California HIMSS chapter, I want to thank you for your contribution to the program this morning, and we're going to give you a little token of our appreciation here. So that's a little representation of that. Thank you so much, Eddie. And photo op. All right, thank you.